Welcome to The Secrets of Success. By following the proven techniques of the guests who appear on this series, you'll learn that even successful people run into detours and failures, and how you can apply their success techniques to change your life.
You're now listening to the most unique show on radio, the show dedicated to making you a success. Nuala Walsh says, if you want to make smarter decisions, just tune in. Nuala, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be here, Bill. Thank you.
Now, I did a little play on words. Tune in is the title of your book. Am I correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. You begin that book by saying the most underestimated risk facing modern society is human decision risk. Now, when I read that, I thought, wouldn't people say that in 1920 and 1950 and 1990? Why do you feel it's more so today?
Well, I think they, I'm not sure they would even have said it in the past. I think the problem now is that there are two factors. One is the external environment that we operate in. So the fact is that because we are so bombarded by information, overwhelmed by data and distraction, that we have less time than ever to really think about what matters in our decision making. Because that is the case, I would absolutely say that it is a more difficult environment for us to make good decisions. And in many ways, I argue that the environment is against us doing so. Again, if you consider, because it's our attention spans are so much shorter than ever before. It is just getting harder and harder to make a good decision.
And I would agree with you.
The thing I would point to when you say that is the environment is against us, but we don't realize it. So I think it's underestimated, Bill. We don't really appreciate the fact that it is human decision risk and that we are up against it because we don't think about it. We think about all of these external factors, but we don't think about how we really think and how we make unconscious errors.
Well, that's why I love your book, Tune In, because you do think about it. You've brought some of them out, and I think this is one of those wonderful books we often tell our audience, if you're looking for something to read on a plane or just to stimulate conversation, this is definitely one of those books you want to read with either a marker or a highlighter, because you're going to be bringing some of these facts out to people and both astounding them, surprising them, and they're going to be looking at you and saying, boy, you're really smart. I think this is the perfect book for all of us. Now, if I read correctly, you say that people base decisions on who they see, not what they hear. So are we more visual than what we're hearing? Is that what you're saying?
Well, absolutely. And at the end of the day, again, that's not something we even think about. So what I argue is that we are more visual, and in many respects, that's evidenced through even neuroscience. We know that we, rely on what we see far quicker than what we hear. And it's an immediate problem, because at the end of the day, we rush to judgment. And there are lots of examples how we do that without even thinking about it. And, the reasons are pretty fundamental. I mean, if you even take physics, you see lightning before you hear thunder, or you will see a goal scored before you hear the crowd roar. So at the end of the day, that's just because, sound travels slower than light. So, and then you might consider neuroscience. You actually just can't take in too much data. We just judge immediately on what we see because it's easier and it's quicker. And then the other thing is, Bill, how we learn. We learn visually. So more people learn through visual techniques rather than auditory or any other technique. So we know that visual images and pictures help people learn quicker and better. So it's a combination of those factors that make us rely on what we see rather than what we hear. And that's a massive problem. Because, as you know, we just rush to judgment. And I've added plenty of examples in the book of how people have actually done that. And, from the famous violinist who played in a Washington, D.C. subway, and for nearly 3/4 of an hour, only 7 people stopped to listen to him, to a world famous art critic, Abraham Bredius, who basically his whole life's work was around the Johann Vermeer paintings. He couldn't spot a forgery. He was 82. He failed to spot that it was a fake, and it was sold for millions. He didn't ask the fundamental questions. Why is it that all of a sudden these rare paintings are now on the market? And the answer was, of course, because they're a forgery, and there were quite a few of them. So this desire to see what we want to see, to hear what we want to hear, takes over rational thought.
Now, if I'm correct, also, I made a note here, I think you said there was something like over 75 psychological biases, fallacies, and effects that we're dealing with more or less on an everyday basis with the information we both see and hear. Was that correct?
Well, it's partially correct. We're actually dealing with 200. In the book, I only traced 75 and I deliberately, and 200, as you know, is far too many for anyone to even comprehend, let alone track. And that's exactly why I built in a really simple diagnostic for people to use, just 10 traps with 6 or 7 biases underneath each, so that people could try and remember this as a diagnostic to prevent error. And then if they do make a mistake, to analyze it afterwards, as in what was the main cause and how can I trace that back to particular biases. And the problem is with all of those biases is that they are individual, but they're kind of linked as well. So they don't operate independently. You can analyze any story, any scandal, anything that happens in the world, or even just people's ordinary behavior in terms of which biases are at play, and it is an interplay. So I've called it the force multiplier effect, but in simple terms, that just means that they all interact and they can kind of bounce off each other and trigger each other as well. So ego and power is probably an obvious combination, or add in emotion to anything, quite frankly. And you have a range of biases that are going to affect your decision making.
I love the quote you took from Stephen Covey. You say, "I am not a product of my circumstances. I am a product of my decisions." And I think when that lights up in our head, we say, well, wait a minute, we like to blame, the traffic is bad, or the doctor made a mistake, or the teacher wasn't alert to something that happened in school. But it's really our decision, isn't it, that is leading us into these paths, not circumstances that are happening around us.
It is an intricate combination of both. And I think that's the whole point. Your context alone, as you're absolutely right, people love to blame. It's the markets, it's the weather. They don't look internally. They don't look to say that it's themselves. We don't attribute any blame to ourselves. In actual fact, people don't even believe that they're biased. 90% of people believe that they are less susceptible to bias than anyone else, which of course is completely untrue. And it's the same way that people think that they're great listeners or great decision makers or even more moral than anybody else. So that's called the above average effect, which basically means we all think we're better than other people when it comes to driving, when it comes to communicating, when it comes to dancing or anything. Quite frankly, there have been lots of studies that show that. But I think what I've tried to do in the book is show, you mentioned earlier on about, this fast-paced world, because we live in this crazy, overwhelming world with data where we rely on what we see, but also this first rush to judgment, the first thing that we hear, we tune out the voices that really matter and fail to consider enough of the variables that make us tune out. And when we tune out, it's not just that we get it wrong, but other people feel unheard. And we know that there is a whole movement, the polarization in the world today, greater than it has ever been, whether you're talking about politics, sports, even in organizations. The rate of activism is rising. The rate of crime is rising. More and more groups really are feeling unheard and are distrusting, the establishment. And I think we read about that in the papers every single day. So there is a price to pay in terms of this polarization and activism and distrust, from tuning out, from not recognizing that we are active agents and responsible for our own decisions. And if we only just gave our actions a little bit more thought and consideration and analysis, we really would avoid, I guess, a lot more regret than we are liable to.
Well, before we go further, Nuala, I'd like to let our audience know that if you're just tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Our guest today is Nuala Walsh, that's spelled Nuala WALSH. Her book is Tune In. And Nuala, we're going to ask you, is there a website where we can learn more information about this?
Yes, indeed. There's a website for the book, and indeed I've about 100 articles across a whole range of outlets like Inc. or Forbes or Psychology Today or the Harvard Business Review, and people can access them very easily in one place, which is www.nuala, Walsh, WALSH.com.
And again, this book can be read on several levels, whether you're a teacher, whether you're someone who just wants to be informed about what's going on, what biases are affecting you when you're making a decision, and or maybe your neighbor too. Maybe they're not as smart as you. Maybe they haven't read this book. All of a sudden they're asked to make decisions and they're getting either misinformation or what's the expression, alternative truths or half-truths. Or just people who are out there being con men, con women, fooling us and saying, hey, if I can do this long enough, I can walk away with 50, 60, $100 million, $1 billion. Why not do it? And in some cases, they're doing it. Nuala, I read a statement in your book. You say that the same individual can be incredibly smart and incredibly stupid. What does that really mean? We would think that's a misstatement, but can you explain that?
It starts from the point of view that people who rise to the top of their organization or their college or their profession or wherever they are, people think they're smart. They think they've got to where they are and they're successful, and a lot of them are. But the point I'm trying to make there is that you can make these decisions, but also you can fall off the pedestal pretty quickly. You've got people like Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, for example, really smart, China's billionaire entrepreneur, made a huge mistake by criticizing the Chinese government, and he disappeared for 2 years, and the biggest IPO sort of just disappeared. You've got an example of someone who was hugely successful, but equally, and that was a stupid thing to do because he knew there was the wrong thing to do. He said before he spoke, I don't know whether I should come here today and say this or not, which meant that he tuned out his voice of conscience and common sense, but ego arguably took over, and he went ahead and really criticized the Chinese government and ultimately paid the price. And you see it in financial services. People rise to the top and suddenly they make one mistake and they're cancelled. You see it in sports. So the same person can be smart. You can have a really clever teacher who is doing incredibly well in their school, and they can fall foul to temptation, and there are plenty of examples where people have had inappropriate relationships or whether they've been accused of misconduct, and that's a stupid decision. And so what I'm saying is that the same person can be both. So somebody asked me recently, who do I think is a really great decision maker? And I'm not sure that we can really say that, because you, Bill, might be fantastic in your job there, but you might go home and make a really stupid decision when it comes to finances or doing your garden. So, or in the kitchen, you cannot unilaterally say to someone, you're always a great decision maker in every scenario, because it's just not true and it's just not feasible. So the point of the book is to make sure that you are smarter in as many cases as possible. And when you are at risk of getting things wrong, that's when you can tune in and look at, am I liable to an ego trap or an emotional trap, or am I just following my neighbor because of what they're doing, or am I just jumping on the bandwagon, or am I just not believing something that I'm told about somebody or a situation and burying my head in the sand? That's the ostrich effect. Or just wishful thinking, in a relationship, that everything will work out when it's palpably obvious that it won't. So that's why I say there are 75 of these that you could just label. And when you label, Bill, it's much easier for you to control whatever the issue happens to be.
And I think that's a great point, because we all get so wrapped up in either movie stars, great athletes, or people who have done some wonderful accomplishment. But again, they may be the world's greatest dancer, singer, entertainer, or basketball player, whatever. But that doesn't mean they're going to be a great leader. That doesn't mean they're going to be an author, or that we should believe what they're espousing, because it may have no basis in fact. But because they have a high profile and we see them on television or hear them on the radio, we, I think, perhaps tend to believe them or say, well, there might be something there. They're so good at football or singing. Let's follow them. I think on page 21 in your book, you have 4 factors that help shape our judgments. Can you tell us what those are?
Yes. And that goes back really to, I guess, the point about the environment. And they are, so I said that we live in a very frantic world, if you like. And there are 4 factors that I've picked out there. And one is that it's a high-speed world. And what that just means is the fact that we have this fast-paced frantic lifestyle. And because of that, it accelerates our tendency to be short term. So when you're always in a hurry, you're going to think short term. You're going to make impulsive, instant decisions rather than reflecting when you should. Now, sometimes, of course, fast is important and it matters. But in some of these cases, we don't take the luxury of reflecting when we should. The second one is data. And because we have so much data all around us, 32 times more than we've ever had before, it's a distraction. It overwhelms the mind. It can paralyze us, but it can also distract us. So, for example, there is one study that shows that when you have the more information you have, the worse it is, and people automatically like to think that more data is better. So, this university professor found that people who were exposed to 88 variables were no more accurate in their predictions than those people who were exposed to just 5 variables. So when it comes to data, our confidence increases, not our accuracy. So that tendency for us to just seek more and more data, it disrupts and distracts our thinking. And then the third one is, I think I've argued that we live in a polarized world. And of course, that is exactly what I was mentioning earlier on, which is the great divide, the them and us. You know, you're either sporty or you're cerebral. You're either right or wrong, positive or negative. And your choices are binary as well. Well, will I go to Rome or Denver on my holidays? So when we frame our choices in either or, we sort of position it as win or lose. So if you pick the wrong one, well, you've lost. And people do this when it comes to mergers and expansion and investment. So it's not just, what college will I go to? Well, if I go to this college, it doesn't mean you've lost or you've done worse off because you didn't go to this other one. But because we've mentally framed it in this binary way, it increases our tendency to think in polarized ways. Like, are you a Republican or a Democrat? So we automatically then rush to judgment. So that's the polarized way of thinking. And then the last one is exactly as you mentioned earlier on, is the visual world. And again, the visual world is exactly that, where we rely on what we see rather than what we hear. And, we rely on our images and first impressions rather than actually exploring other factors, which give us more broad ways of thinking. So that instinctive sort of thinking can lead to huge error, as we find out all the time.
As I'm looking at those 4 factors, though, I could just as easily think and say, that's giving us more information, and we should be making, I would think, better decisions. We've, I guess, always been taught, try to get as much information on something, the best recipe, the best way to do a procedure in sports, etc. And yet, the more we seem to have, more access to it, whether it's the computer, the TV, a newspaper, a magazine article, visual stimulus, someone speaking right in front of us, we seem to either get more distracted or go in the wrong direction, let's put it that way. And as you said, get more polarized. So we've got people sure they're right, whether it's about pets or sports teams and or political parties, whatever. Do you find we're more emotional in our decisions, or are we more rational?
Oh, that's a huge question, Bill. I'm actually going to say more emotional because there are 27 different emotions. So again, you'd have to break down which one. But in terms of fear, anxiety, there's a huge amount of fear of missing out now. And again, it's all big, help thanks to the internet or because of the internet. Fear of missing out is much more prevalent, I think. I think there's a greed factor. I think there's more impatience to be seen and to be successful. Now, it's not that those factors haven't always existed, but I think that they are amplified in the world that we live in. So it's not that we're not rational, because of course we are rational, but the difference, the gradient shows. And like the hate crime is increasing. Well, that's an emotional decision, not a rational decision. So unfortunately, suicides and school shootings are all rising. Scams are rising. They're all emotion based, whether it's fear, greed, or anything else. So of course we are, as a nation, more rational than we are emotional. That doesn't mean we have that, because otherwise you would have absolute anarchy every day. But your question is, the emotional element is certainly increasing. And again, that polarization, people dig down and feel really strongly. And maybe just to give you a really, quick example about that is that to prove that if you ask people to evaluate people you disagree with, 3/4 of people, according to, I think it was at the Edelman survey on trust, 3/4 of people will not help, live with, or work with people who disagree with them. Now, what kind of emotion is in there?
Wow. Nuala, more and more, this is fascinating. But again, I have to take a brief break and let our audience know that if you're tuning in, you're listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan. Our guest today is Nuala, spelled Nuala Walsh. She is the author of the book, Tune In, and that's what we're talking about today. And Nuala, would you tell us the website where we can learn more about this?
Sure. It's www.nuala, Nualagh, Walsh, WALSH.com.
And I'm going to tell you, I really enjoy this book. And if you find, sometime you get to a cocktail party and you don't know what to talk about, you pick up this book and start even looking at 1 or 2 chapters. You're going to be the most interesting person in the room because to me, this information is fascinating. Now, Nuala, you've mentioned how we make judgments, and I think you've broken it down into categories of misjudgments, let's call it. And you use the word perimeters. I think there's 10 categories that you have there. Could you tell us what that stands for and start going through them with us?
Sure. And at the end of the day, this is a set of misjudgment traps, and they're all based around 10 factors, which will be very familiar to people. So the first one is power-based traps. So that's when we elevate, idols or authorities or experts, and basically disproportionately so that you sublimate these other groups rather than yourself. The second one is E for ego, and that's when we overvalue or are overcommitted to our own voice above other people. R is for risk, and these traps are when we recklessly pursue, sensation seeking, or we're basically intolerant of doubt and uncertainty. I is for the identity-based traps, which are very common now, and that's when we have this an insatiable craving to impress our in-groups with self-image. And, everything we do on social media, I guess, falls into that bracket as well, or when we're unable to shift our identity because we want to be a certain title. M is for memory-based traps, and that's when we overtrust our ability to recall data or conversations. E is for ethics-based trap, when we overestimate or don't really resist enough temptation, and we don't do the right thing. T is for time, and that's when we overweight the past, present, or future as the best course of action when we're trying to make decisions. And there are quite a few biases that contribute there. E is for emotions, we just touched on, and that's when we mismanage our ability to stay calm and regulate impulse, instinct, or excess. Relationship-based traps are really about the crowd, and that's when we're predisposed to delegate our decisions or just follow the momentum of the crowd when we're uncertain about how to move forward. And the final one is S for stories, and that's when we just readily accept the first thing we hear, any social, political, or organizational narrative as fact, and fail to challenge these. And again, there are lots of really practical, easy, and really interesting examples from business, space, the medical world, serial killers that exemplify each of those traps and how we're at risk of falling into them.
This gets more and more fascinating. Now, Nuala, how do you tell people, though, once they have that list, and even that in itself, that's 10 items there to try to remember, do they use that as a checklist, or do you suggest that we look to ourselves to see how we're responding, or to either take a news show and just almost do it as a drill and say, what are they saying here, and compare it to what another channel says?
It's a really, really good question. You can use it even if you just remembered what the word perimeters, even if you remember, and that's why it's deliberately a mnemonic. Even if there's something happening and you're under pressure to make a decision, even if you don't have the book beside you, and you go through your head and you say, am I liable to make a misjudgment because of ego, or some story someone's telling me, or an ethical temptation, time? Am I just deciding too quickly about this? even if you take it that really high level, simplistic way, in many cases, Bill, I've found that you can just say, you can slow down. And this is all about using this as a checklist to slow down so that you can analyze the decisions before you make a mistake. And if you make a mistake, then you can go back. Now, as I said, there are 75 biases. So they're the 10 high level traps. There are 6 or 7 in each of these categories that you can read and say, well, I think it's the illusion of invulnerability, or it's the ostrich effect, or it's wishful thinking, or present bias, or whatever. And they're great terms. They're really easy to remember as well. So all you do is you use it as a checklist first, and then you use it as a diagnostic tool before you make a mistake and after you make a mistake. Hopefully you don't make too many mistakes, but that's what you can use it for. If you do that, it stops you making them in the future.
I love that suggestion. To me, it's almost like when they go back over a play in sports or sometime in a courtroom trial, and the commentator will take you and say, notice how the witness blinked, or their body language gave something away, or they raised their voice, or they got very nervous. Of course, if people perspire, etc. But just by looking at that, we could analyze something we hear and say, well, wait a minute, maybe the fact that they say 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste, maybe they only interviewed 10 dentists. Or maybe maybe they paid them to try it and they said, yeah, it's a good toothpaste. Okay, what's really in those words? Does that mean we should do it? 9 out of 10, maybe they pick people who live right near the toothpaste factory, and it's very popular in their town. So what should we do to start this off tomorrow? How can we start doing better and tuning in?
Yeah, I do have a whole section, and we won't go into it now. It'll take us far too long. But there is a whole section. There are 18 different sonic strategies that people can employ. So people can read those at their leisure. So it's really, really practical. But something that people can do straight away is, okay, now they know about the perimeter traps. That's one. Use it as a checklist. But the other thing is that what I've suggested is that even if people just set a decision rule. So if you decide so you're unsure about something, you think you're liable to be at risk. You've just decided, I think I really am vulnerable here to error. Set a decision rule, and it can be anything. It can be, I'm never going to decide on a Sunday. I'm always going to ask 3 people, what do they think? I'm always going to ask questions and question answers. I'm not going to make this decision until I get at least 2 more pieces of information. You decide the rule that works for you, your team, your family, etc.
Nuala, I love it. And I just want to remind our listeners, the book is Tune In by our guest, Nuala, Nuala Walsh. One more time, the website?
NualaGWalsh.com.
You've been listening to The Secrets of Success on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm your host, Bill Horan, asking you to please join us again next week at the same time when we will continue our journey to success.